sitting here with Professor Karl Steel of the English department and his student, Jehiah Alleyne, who are in a class on Chaucer, right? This semester. So Jehiah just came to Brooklyn College this semester, and I'm interested in your prior studies at Kingsborough and how you decided to become a double major, I believe, in classics and English.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Well, my prior studies at Kingsborough were interesting. I've done a lot of independent reading, but also I enjoyed my professors at Kingsborough to an extent. I did previously do fashion design, which, while being interested in fashion design, I was also very interested in humanities. Unbeknownst to me at the given time, I would say I'm 16, 17, I didn't realize actually being a professor was a thing which one can actually do. So I sort of thought like, oh, well, I enjoy reading. I enjoyed a lot of reading. I enjoyed reading a lot of philosophy, myth, literature, psychology, and that kind of went on. But then I came to realize that I'm enjoying my reading, and the writing I do center around such reading a lot more than I enjoy sewing. So yeah, I guess it came about in that way.
I see. You've lost that interest entirely, or it's still somewhat interesting to you?
I still have this one machine. It hasn't been.
I'm talking about design and fashion, not the sewing part.
Yeah, pretty much. I would say I've lost it entirely.
I see. Okay. So how did you wind up in a medieval class? You have a wide range of periods from which to choose in English.
Mm-hmm.
Why Chaucer?
Well, I believe it was. I think it was Bakhtin who called Chaucer.
You have to speak louder.
I believe it was Bakhtin that said Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is kind of sort of like the proto novel, with all these disparate voices all coming together on this pilgrimage. And I will admit I'm struggling with the Middle English, but I guess it's my first encounter. And I don't know. I think the older one typically goes, I'm usually interested in things that are relatively old. I'm a classics reader after all, and I thought it was interesting. I didn't know much about Chaucer or about Middle English, and I figured that it is the tongue I hold so dear. Why not study it?
Well, it's a good answer. I wouldn't have expected it. Did you go to high school here?
Yes, I went to Midwood, which is down the street from here.
Across the street, yeah.
And I also transferred out because I didn't really have the best time there, and I went to this creative, sort of independent school called City As School in Manhattan.
Yeah.
I believe Basquiat went there for a little bit. Yeah. But that was an interesting time. I had a lot of creative freedom to explore my interests. During my time there, I wrote papers on some about economics and the free market and Young. His idea of the flexible unconscious. I still have those papers there, and I think one on like the Gothic literature we were reading, and I don't remember exactly what we were reading. So I had a lot of creative freedom there. I enjoyed it, and it was very formative for me in regards to having that freedom, because I didn't really have that in a typical school environment. So I like that in Midwood.
So, in other words, it's sort of a place-based learning school where you branch out into the areas, the neighborhoods, and do that kind of interactive engagement and research.
Kind of, And also, another thing that's really interesting about that particular school, I don't think I've never heard of a school doing this anywhere else. Instead of having classes 5 days a week, depending on your schedule, you either have an internship of your choosing 3 to 2 days a week. So it was a lot of freedom.
This is the equivalent of junior high.
This is in the equivalent of junior high, and then sort of senior year was COVID, so there was no internships or that exploration of any kind. It was just kind of at home. But I mean, that was the whole world.
So Karl, I've known you a long time, but I don't know that I've ever asked you how you developed your interest in the medieval period. But I want to say that when we hired you, was it about 2008?
2007.
2007, even longer ago. One of the people on our appointments committee said, he's got a medieval party going on in his head all the time. So how did that come to be?
Well, I mean, the joke I make is that I went to medieval studies because I thought that's where the money was. But it's more that, I did my undergraduate degree. I did 4 years off doing this and that, office jobs, playing in bands and touring and having kind of this same year over and over again. You'd form a band, you'd go on tour, you'd break up, and you'd do it again. And I got tired of that. And a friend showed up in town, and I said, "Where have you been?" He says, "I'm getting a master's degree in math." "How are you doing that? How are you paying for it?" He says, "Oh, they pay me, and I teach." And I was like, "Oh, incredible, you can do that." So I applied to Western Washington University, and in English, I thought, well, what else am I good at? I'm good at writing, I'm good at reading. And the one person in the department who had any kind of national reputation, Rick Emerson, was the medievalist. So when I realized that I wanted to keep doing this, that I could keep doing this, I attached myself to the medievalist and used him as a launch pad for getting into Columbia. So it was a sort of practical decision. I got on well with post-colonial scholar there. I did some translating for him out of French, but it was Rick really who launched me.
Had he been a Columbia student?
No, but he knew everybody. So he called Bob Hanning and said, "I've got a guy for you." Because it was we were still floating in the tail end of the old boys network, and I think he opened a door for me.
I see.
Yeah.
So it was.
So it could have been anything.
It was accidental.
It was,
had
yes.
it not been that he was who he was, and with a reputation and a good teacher.
Yeah. So as an undergraduate, I went to Evergreen, so there was no grades, and we could just design our own courses. And so I took courses in.
I think you should explain that a little more.
Oh, there were no grades, so you just wrote evaluations of yourself, and the instructors wrote evaluations of you. And there were courses on the books that you could take, but you could also get together with your friends and design a course and seek a faculty advisor who would pop in from time to time to see that you were doing something. And so I took courses in French photography. I did a course in epic poetry. I read all of Fairy Queen, and I think I read Paradise Lost twice while I was in college there. And then some friends and I got together and realized that James Joyce was the thing, and so we just read Joyce for a quarter, and then we read a good chunk of Finnegan's Wake in the second quarter. And so and then the French, I was reading a lot of post-colonial stuff. And so when I got to my MA, the translation was a Malayan writer named Yambo Gulum, and his novel Le Devoir de Violence, which is a wonderful plagiarized, dangerous novel from the late 60s. And so I feel like I've read. I came into graduate school having read across a wide range of things. I think a lot of medievalists get into it because they've read Tolkien, and it sort of atrophies, I think, their aesthetic at a kind of adolescent level.
Mm-hmm. It's good for video games, though.
He's a good writer, but
yes.
There's a lot of good writers.
Were you ever interested in Tolkien?
I have the first part of the Lord of the Rings, and I've never read it. I've had the first part of the Lord of the Rings. I've never read it, so I've never really been. Maybe I'll read his. He did a large translation of Beowulf, right, and with commentary.
He was I don't know if he translated Beowulf, but he certainly wrote essays on it. He was a medievalist like C.S. Lewis, and his essay on Beowulf the Monsters is groundbreaking, a really extraordinary work of literary criticism.
Yes, exactly.
In the sense that he tried to understand the monsters as monsters, quite literally, as scary beings, and not as kind of coded something this or that, Christianized allegories or misunderstood natural forces or something. He, as somebody who wrote in fantasy himself, he understood how monsters worked in literature, and it's one of these literary turns that feels so simple when someone does it, but someone has to do it in order to break with outmoded ways of reading. And these people in the 8th century or whenever it was written certainly were afraid of the dark, justifiably so. Who knows what was out there?
Well, this is a good lead-in for my next question. I'm going to ask you first. Has your professor brought up animals in your study of Chaucer?
Yes, that one time.
Well, I've tried to tamp it down.
Yes, he's brought it up. But it was a specific time we were talking about. I believe it was the trial in which they put animals on trial. In order to dignify, if the animal had unfortunately killed or eaten, I believe it was an infant or
generally speaking, it's somebody who can't get away from the pig, and so it's generally going to be an infant or a toddler.
Yeah. So and that was interesting, but it was only once. But it was an interesting idea because the idea of giving some dignity to that which was unfortunately killed by said animal and putting the animal on trial definitely seems absurd to modernize. But I guess if we remove we remove the imposition of our lens onto theirs, you come to understand, I guess, in his brief explanation, that is actually maybe the way of giving people dignity, and also the animal dignity. But I don't know. Even.
So, what do you have to say about it?
Sure. So this is in Chaucer's Knight's Tale. There's a temple of Mars with a painting that illustrates the various things that Mars is up to. And what's always surprising to me about it is that rather than showing images of war and glory, the preponderance of these images are images of mayhem and catastrophe, terrible accidents, a carter who's overrun by his own cart is turned over on him and crushed him, or a cook who's scalded to death in the kitchen, which is not typically something we think of as belonging to the world that Mars supervises. And among these catastrophes is a pig that eats a child right in the cradle, just right there. And I say to my students, I'm going to tell you something. You're going to remember this because I've done this many times in this Chaucer class, and no one ever forgets this, which is that if a pig ate a child, which is something that could happen and did happen, if we were on the continent in France or Belgium, for example, you put the pig on trial. And people have typically understood that as indicating that medieval people were superstitious. They thought that animals had moral responsibility or legal responsibility. Well, they certainly didn't think that. And you can find legal commentary that says they didn't. What they did want, however, and this is what Jehiah just said, is they wanted to restore dignity to the person who had been killed. And the way to do that is by having a trial. And the animal will almost certainly be found guilty. But in the process, this poor child who's been killed will be publicly mourned, because a murder trial is not just an attempt to punish someone, it's also to acknowledge publicly that this life had value. So that's the speech I give about animal trials. Yeah. And it helps explain this bizarre, strange line in the Temple of Mars in the Knight's Tale.
And it's not the case in England at the same time?
No, England's got something called the Deodand law, which is that if there's an accidental death, the value of the thing that has caused the accidental death is assessed, and that's paid as a fine to the coroner and passes it on to the king. And that lasts until the 19th century, because when train engines start exploding, they're far too expensive to the train companies didn't want to do this. So it's bound up with the development of the insurance industry kind of steps in where the DoD won't spend. But that has to do with the fact that England is precociously centralized in its government in a way that France and what's now Belgium and the Netherlands are not.
So you know that Karl has written books about animals.
Yes.
And the difference between animals and humans. Or you've also written about humans as different from animals, right? So tell us about your interest and how somebody who started off as sort of run-of-the-mill medievalist developed this particular slant on the period.
Sure. Credit is due to...
And by the way, by run-of-the-mill, I just mean interested in the major texts.
Sure. Well, I have to give credit to the person who became my dissertation advisor, Susan Crane, who had just come to Columbia from Rutgers, I think. She might have been at Rutgers right before. And among her first seminars was a course on critical animal studies and medieval literature, where Derrida had published an essay in the early aughts.
And Derrida is
a post-structuralist French philosopher, mostly known for his work on language and the kind of slipperiness of concepts. And one of his central interests throughout his career is the interdependent categories of human and animal. And he finally, kind of as his last set of lectures, translated as "The Animal, but Therefore I Am, I Know Indulgence Sweet," is about this. And Crane put Derrida in conversation with a range of medieval texts, and as well as works in anthropology. And it just blew my mind. I was so excited. And I didn't know at the time that when a senior scholar is teaching a seminar that's on an unusual topic, the reason they're doing that is because they're working on a book. And I said, "Oh, this is my dissertation." And very graciously, she didn't stand in my way. And so my book came out before her book did. Just barely.
And is there lots of crossover between you?
We approach things very differently. I think our books play well together, but we come up at things very differently. My thing coalesced. I was flying across the country. I was stuck with a bad dissertation idea. And at some point, probably flying over Minnesota or Wyoming or something, I thought, meat is the thing. There's no book about eating meat in the Middle Ages. And there's all these rules and ideas about meat and eating people and so forth. Someone's got to write that book. And so that's what the dissertation started as. And then it turned into, how is it that people justify this? How do you get away with it? How is this morally of no importance? And that turned into a book about humans and animals. A dissertation and then eventually a book. And I think it had to do with questions of justice, of ethics, of the problem of domination, and kind of political issues that I've been long exercised by. And so that was sort of also one of the engines of this, apart from an interest in poetry, all the other things why we do what we do.
So you're interested in classics. That's new too, or it was germinated before?
Well, the human humanities usually like a large umbrella. So yes and no. I had a brilliant psychotherapist. I still do. And he is a former classicist and a literature professor who did the Latin Greek Institute, which is the Institute for Intensive Learning in both Latin and Greek.
So he studied it, or he ran it?
He did the Latin Greek Institute, and then he did some translation of Sophocles, which he gifted to me. And that was really formative. And
that was when you were at Kingsborough?
This is when I was at Kingsborough, or at least just before. I think it was during Kingsborough. And so the classics have always been something that's there. I'm very interested in early Christian ideas and Christian metaphysics. And the Greek language does seem to, or the ancient Greek language, I'd say more specifically, does seem to be incredibly musical. And I'm learning it now. It's going well so far. I do want to do the Latin Greek. I do want to attend the Latin Greek Institute this summer for the intensive in Greek, mainly because a lot of the research that I think I want to conduct in during my time, I guess, in academia, is centered around Christian metaphysics, whether it's kenosis and this is the self-emptying of Christ, or Latin's emphasis on the ratio, which is just reason, which I know that you were doing
a book on that.
yeah. And so I think it's integral. I don't think I want to be a classicist. I do want to be classically trained.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
it's helpful.
Yeah, very helpful.
So he and I have talked a fair amount about his interest in the metaphysical poets, and so as I've observed, if you're going to read Donne at all, Milton at all, it doesn't hurt to know Latin and Greek, because they certainly did.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I unfortunately have little Latin and less Greek.
Yeah.
But when I first met you, you had a copy of a book about metaphysical poetry.
Yeah, it was Helen Gardner's anthology on the metaphysical poets.
And did you finish it?
No, I switched to the Northern Critical edition of John Donne, and I'm sort of going through that right now.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of paused because right now in my Shakespeare class we're reading his sonnets.
Oh, you're doing Shakespeare as well.
Yeah. I love Shakespeare. I'm very comfortable with early modern English, and so I find his plays to be incredibly interesting, incredibly fascinating. I mean, we just went over Romeo and Juliet, and I wrote a paper on how sort of Romeo was a proto-romantic. He Shakespeare sort of anticipates the romantic movement in using Keats' sort of negative culpability, which is sort of dwelling in contradiction, and also Phoenix and the Turtle, which is that beautiful, also sort of difficult and paradoxical poem, which I really liked upon reading it. I read that first in the Helen Gardner's Metaphysical Poets, and so I was writing a paper on how Romeo embodies this proto-romantic ideal, or sort of this lack of distinction between sort of desire and you know what I mean, and spirituality of it. You know what I mean? He sort of, upon seeing Juliet, he sort of worships her and praises her, and you wonder whether or not he's sort of orbiting her or actually engaging in a genuine relationship with her, which is something that you do wonder a lot about when it comes to the romantic poets, and especially how they write about romance, especially Byron. She Walks in Beauty comes to mind. He's sort of filled with this, I don't know, this sort of completely captured aesthetically by this woman, so much so that he borders on sort of this worship, and that is very much Romeo. And then eventually we want to write a paper on Julius Caesar and phenomenological blindness, because I think that his manner of attending to the world is what causes the tragedy, not necessarily the people stabbing him in the Senate. So
his blindness brought on
the tragedy.
Yes.
Because in the beginning of the play, there's the soothsayer, which is like a seer or a dreamer, and he goes, "Beware the Ides of March." And on the grounds of the soothsayer being a dreamer, Caesar dismisses him and goes on away, and then the whole tragedy unfolds. So I think that one sort of moment is deeply important about sort of the metaphysics of the play.
So you're thinking about blindness as a flaw.
Yeah. Blindness is a flaw, or sort of but more specifically attention, the way in which he attended to the world, and which is a very phenomenological approach to literature. I've read somewhere, I believe that attention is is how one disposes their consciousness, which is a wonderful definition. And so I think the way in which Julius Caesar disposes his consciousness is actually what causes the tragedy.
I have to make a joke at this point. Did you know that Oedipus fell through a tragic flaw? Did that happen?
Yeah. I have not read Oedipus Rex yet.
You will.
So,
You will. So I want to make a medieval intervention on this, just because you're talking about Romeo anticipating the Romantics, and what I'm thinking of is the delirium of love. in works like Quentin de Croix's Parzival, where he sees a spatter of blood on the snow. I think this is Parzival, not Lancelot. If I'm on tape, so it's one of the two. And he is distracted during the fight because the blood that's spattered on the snow has the aspect of the woman he loves, and he falls into a trance because he's so.
When you say aspect, what do you
in a way that the blood looks like her lips and her cheeks and her eyes.
So
and
visually.
It takes him out of this because she's with him constantly in his head. And this so what I'm saying is I think Shakespeare is drawing on this thing which emerges in Western writing in the 12th century and has roots in Arabic love poetry and prior to that. There's a long arc.
Aesthetic rappers.
Yes, absolutely. Especially around love. Yeah. So, which is not so much blindness as a vision that's oriented to something else much more intently, to the extent that you kind of vanish from this world, for good or for ill. Our hero doesn't die in this case, but he's temporarily in terrible danger.
The other romantic poets, unlike Byron, don't talk very much about romantic love.
Yeah, we talk about vanishing.
They talk about love of the imagination.
Yeah, especially
and its relationship to the natural world, love of the natural world. You see that in Shakespeare?
I don't know. Particularly for that specific angle, I was sort of saying that Romeo anticipated Byron. The love of the natural world would probably come in one of the plays that we read in class, due to being absolutely sort of.
Well, there's something of the greenwood in As You Like It.
Yes, As You Like It, which I've read a very long time ago, at Kingsborough, and the Forest of Arden.
The Forest of Arden.
Yes, the Forest of Arden.
In that play, yes. This is something that I have not thought about, but the movement from the Renaissance to the Romantics, with this enormous gulf in the middle of the Age of Reason in the 18th century. How do we get there? Do you know anything about the 18th century?
Very little.
It's a blind spot.
Yeah,
right?
It is a blind spot.
You've got to take a course in the 18th century.
So, I mean, on the notion of reason and the sort of romantic revolt against the symmetry of, I like to emphasize reason, sort of this will to symmetry, in the way that it seems that the romantic poets, by emphasizing the imagination or by emphasizing the beauty of nature, are sort of defenders of the asymmetry of reality, that which isn't reducible to the tangible mind. And so I think it's perhaps maybe, and again, I don't want to make this a large claim, but perhaps a revolt against reductionism, revolt against the reductionism of reason, because reason left untethered to grace or love or the imagination, becomes sterile.
Interestingly, though, studies on the imagination originate in the 18th century, the end of the 17th and into the 18th century. So at the same time that we have the Age of Reason, the age of engines, of mechanics, of extracting resources from the natural world, we also have this intense interest in imagination. David Hume, there was a Scottish school that was very interested in studying the psychology of imagination, and there's far more continuity, I think, as one gets deeply into a period. from one period to another than would seem. They're not really as oppositional as it as on the surface it appears. So when you say they call themselves the moderns,
people like Abelard and so forth, most modernity.
So we are always comparing ourselves with what comes before.
Yes.
So in relation to the classical world, they were indeed the moderns. Is that what they're thinking of?
Yeah. And they felt that they were at a period of change, and that meant, of course, highlighting the discontinuities and concealing the continuities.
Yeah, and I'm sure that the establishment of the universities in the 13th century had a lot to do with their imagining themselves as moderns.
Yes.
What is it? I think Cambridge is 1209, maybe 1200 for Oxford.
University of Paris,
which is probably before. Yes, yeah. So, are you still thinking of going to graduate school and becoming a professor?
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
And which field will you be thinking of for graduate school?
Comparative literature. So, mainly because after learning classical languages, I would like to learn some modern languages. Mainly because of my interest in phenomenology, so probably French and German. And also I'm comparative literature mainly because of its fluidity.
Because why?
Because of its fluidity. So I don't, because if I were to just say a classicist, I might be a bit more limited. I mean, I would like to see how classical texts influence, Romantics or influence Shakespeare, and so to be able to move fluidly throughout, let's say, the literary tradition is something that I value, and something that I can probably do in comparative literature better than other degrees of specialization.
So the period is less determined than the broad concept of comparison.
Yeah. And the period can always come later.
That's right.
Yeah. People switching graduate school.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I know somebody who started out as a Renaissance person and wound up as an Americanist. So these things do happen to the best. What is your new book about?
It's about reason. The standard definition of what it means to be human from the Greek people through to the Middle Ages is man is the rational, moral animal. And so I've written 2 books about humans and animals, and I thought, well, what is this thing, the human? I know what moral is. It means that we're not gods. I know what animal means. It means we're alive. We have an anima, a soul. But I don't really know what reason is, and what medieval people said about reason and what modern people think they mean when they say reason, I think are 2 different things. So let's write a book that's thinking about the definitions and the limits of this concept of reason in the Middle Ages. And so there's I've got a couple of chapters on scholastic philosophy, kind of running from Aristotle through to the scholastics. Then I go back to Beowulf. Then I go to I have a chapter on anger and reason, emotion and reason. And I'm working on a chapter right now about a medieval French mystic named Margaret Perret, who was burned as a heretic in early 14th century Paris, where she, in her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, which is a guide to self-annihilation, reason is the great enemy of love. And what is happening? What is she doing to reason in this book? So that's what the book is. I'm working on the Perret chapter right now.
How close are you to finish?
I have one more chapter, which is it's a chapter on the limits and problems of the concept of dehumanization. So everything's been taken on the road a couple of times. I gave Pierre-Olivier Dietmar at the École des Études Sociales in Paris did me the honor of inviting me to give 4 talks. And I was interrupted by COVID, but eventually I got to go and go to Paris and give 4 talks, and that really did help push this along. In English. The talks are in English and stuff.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, thank God very much. Yeah. Questions were in French. Talks were in English.
It's wonderful
that
you're able
Yeah.
So how is reason the enemy of love?
Reason is the enemy of love because reason is propositional. It's concerned with objects and knowing them, and it's concerned with rules. And love risks everything for the sake of love. It risks shame, disgrace. It is indifferent to. It seeks humiliation to elevate itself. All these things that reason can't understand. That's how Margaret portrays it. And what is interesting to me is that she eventually calls reason a beast, which is calls it a donkey. Reason's thinkings are donkey's work, which is that oxymoron is really where she takes work that had already been done in mystical theology and pushes it to a point where I don't think anybody had ever reached. And I don't think that why she was burned. There are all kinds of political reasons why she was executed, but she does go further, I think, than almost any other mystic in her attack on reason.
You say you don't know why she was executed?
Oh, I think there are political reasons why. It has to do with the fight between the King of France and the Pope over who has the command of Christianity in France. And this is the period when the Knights Templar were being dissolved and executed en masse, and the Pope and the King were at loggerheads. And so I think Margaret Perret was burned because it made a good show. But her work still circulated anonymously, so it's not as though they were. Some people thought they were inherently heretical, but obviously some people thought they weren't. So too bad for her. She was also, I think she may have sought it out to a certain degree because she was forbidden from circulating her book, and yet she did.
So she was tough.
She was tough. She was the only woman burned for her book in the Middle Ages.
Well, I'm sorry that it happened to her.
I'm sorry
there's only one.
Yes, exactly.
I actually start my new book on a beheading. I think it is. I can't remember what the manner of execution is, but the king's reaction to executions, which were done for the king. The king deserved justice on behalf of the crown, and the question is, when did the king stop wanting to see these executions? You know, and does it have to do with his recognition that the person being executed in a barbaric manner has a soul, as he has a soul, which is the beginning of understanding deeply someone's interior, which leads to my pet subject of free and direct speech.
Yes.
But that's interesting whether the king sort of dignifies the other. It reminds me of the line from Richard II.
I'm sorry.
The king dignifying the other reminds me of the line from Richard II. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subject of this, how can you say to me, I am a king? So he's a subject which you want to relate to, but not an object to be revered.
I'm having trouble.
Oh, so a subject. The king is sort of. He realizes. Richard II realizes he's a subject to relate to, but not an object to be revered. And that's a little weird.
Yeah.
Which let us sit on the ground and tell sad stories of the deaths of kings.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Richard II, love it, and probably one of my favorites. So yeah, but that does seem. And so how does the king realizing or having empathy for the other tie into free and direct speech?
Well, it's the exercise of imagination, first of all, but the desire of writers from Jane Austen on to understand at the deepest level that a fiction writer can what is going on in a character's mind. You can have the character speak, as in a play, and express thoughts, emotion, but it may not be that what the character says to others is what the character really feels. And if there is a way to get even deeper into a character's mind and watch that character through that process change over the course of a piece of fiction, it turns out that it can be done and is a wonderful narrative strategy for smoothing out the difference between a narrator and a character.
Mm-hmm.
The narrator and the character in the moment that Free and Direct is operating. Imagine the king and the person at the stake about to be burned, having a connection to each other. In fiction, narrator and the character come together through the language of the character, and the narrator is as close as can be to the consciousness of the character.
Would you describe it as empathetic imagination?
I would never have thought of using that idea as a way to describe it, but yeah, it certainly is. If you start speaking as the narrator in the idiom of the character, there is a tremendous amount of empathetic imagination going on.
Yeah. So the empathetic imagination, sort of that dignifying of the other, that realizing that's, I believe it's, maybe you know better, it's Linus who, to mid extinction, that the self actually comes to know itself through the encounter with the other, and it seems like that's what you're doing is sort of like the literary embodiment of that, of realizing, oh, that person also has an anima, a soul, and is subject to the same mortality that I am. And I read it.
It's a little bit of Hegel there.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me about this is, I would say one of the things for your project is in free and direct discourse. There are lines that are not exclusively third person, not exclusively first person. They seem to occupy a hazy ground in between the two, and I think that seems to be what you're talking about.
Yes.
I mean, it's all over, of course, Virginia Woolf, as you're saying. It emerges. We're most aware of it initially in Jane Austen.
Yes.
Yeah.
You knew that.
Was it?
You knew that.
I know it from reading Austen. I know it from our CUNY colleague at Baruch, Stephanie Hirschnau, who works on Austen and free and direct discourse. And you should talk to her.
I should.
Yes, but and I know it just from listening to you and thinking about this as I'm rereading Mrs. Dalloway and worrying over it with another undergraduate.
It really begins for her with Jacob's Room. Have you read that?
That one I have not read.
It's a good one to read, to see how it really, for the first time, develops. And it's not much in evidence in the two novels she wrote prior to Jacob's Room.
Sorry, quite interesting. So I read one time. I believe this is neuroscientist I keep going on about. But he wrote that I believe that empathy and apathy drink from the same well, the distance between the self and the other. So that empathy and apathy arise from how one engages with the other. Apathy seeks to use the other for its own, let's say, immediate gain, and empathy seeks to understand the other. And perhaps the use of free and direct speech, where sort of the narrator, where it blurs between, is it first person and third person?
Yeah.
Is sort of this gray area where you temporarily enter into the shoes of that which, that is not, to the shoes of the other's consciousness. And do you think that's what would you call it, the goal of every writer when they're writing characters?
Not every writer.
Well, fair enough, or should be the goal.
It's also a way to blend the theater and fiction, because the character at the moment of free and direct is really speaking in their own voice, and it's it's a way for the narrator to drop out. It needn't be a first-person narrative for that to happen. But it is, I'm thinking of a novel that you probably wouldn't imagine had anything to do with free and direct. But I'm thinking of Oliver Twist. When Fagin is in jail, there's this incredible sequence in which he's speaking through the narrator. And it is an amazing, empathetic use of free and direct speech of somebody who is not a sympathetic character at all. So, yeah, when Shakespeare animates Edmund, who is not a sympathetic character, through soliloquy, we get a sense of the hurts that he has endured, right? And Shakespeare becomes, in that moment, I think, very empathetic as he exposes himself.
And I mean, I think it's a really brilliant idea, and it's also, I think, a brilliant thing to study, especially along the literary tradition from mentioned, from Oliver Twist to Shakespeare to Virginia Woolf. I don't know. It seems like it seems very akin to the idea of the writer of emptying themselves, which harkens back to one of the sort of Christian metaphysical ideas I am interested in, sort of the kenosis. So I think it's translated as the self-emptying of Christ, where Christ empties himself and he serves rather than he reigns. And so in these brief instances, it seems like, the narrator is performing this sort of kenotic technique where he's emptying himself so he can actually enter into the other.
It's an interesting way of looking at it. I'm most interested in the development through a wonderful book called Language and Thought by a Russian developmental psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, who wrote in the 1930s. And he's interested in the development of speech in children, and recognizes that, first of all, speech is social. We learn to speak because others speak to us. But about the age of 2, children start teaching themselves to do things, activities, by speaking out loud. It's as if they are coaching themselves through their own speech. And that speech, which is very interesting for parents and anyone else in a room with a young kid can listen to, drops out, disappears at around 7. And where does it go?
Where does it go?
Into the head. We start speaking to ourselves. And that kind of internal commentary and dialogue, I think, is the basis for free and direct speech. That somebody like Jane Austen realizes it, I don't think has to do with emptying herself as much as recognizing that this is a means of entrance into the most profound transformations that a character is capable of, if capable at all. A character like Emma is interesting because she changes from the beginning of the novel to the end. And how does that transformation happen? It happens through her dialogues of self and soul. And it's a wonderful way to witness the transformation, to allow us to hear that speech as mediated by the narrator.
So is it sort of is it akin to Martin Buber's I and Thou? Where, you know what I mean? So I
I see where you're going with all of this.
Yeah. No, I'm just because I'm really interested because it sounds very fascinating. I mean, he's all dialogical philosophy. You know what I mean? Directly. You know what I mean? So he distinguishes between I and thou and I and it relationships, and it seems like what you're trying to say, you know, pulling on I guess something that I've read is that it's sort of a free and direct treatise is an I and thou relationship dialogue. Where it, you know what I mean, it dignifies the thou, and I becomes no, you know what I mean, whatever it is. So, for example, the development of the child starts outward, and then it becomes inward, or you know what I mean, or in Emma and Jane Austen, as you said, so the dialogue is directed outward, and then she changes inward. You know what I mean? I becomes through thou, which is incredibly interesting.
That is actually true.
Mm-hmm.
The egotist becomes outward focused.
Mm-hmm.
If that is what you mean,
Yeah.
a recognition
Yeah.
of others in a deep way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think this is just an incredibly interesting conversation,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm so glad I was able to meet with you.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a limit to the amount of time that these interviews can go.
Yes.
But thank you so much, both of you, for being willing to talk with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that we can continue off camera, if not now, at another time.